people? We're back again, and it's time, as always. I just want to be straight off the bat honest with you, and deliver to you the thoughts I'm thinking of now, while I'm trying to think of and conceive of the Beggar's Tomb. And when I do, I remember we are on episode 3, and I remember that we are talking about Neal Leon Cassady, and he is telling the story of how he came to be the man that he is, telling about his early childhood. But before his childhood was the life of his parents. And so far of those parents, we began to talk about his father, and we have brought his life up from the childhood, from the moment he entered this earth, the moment that his birth took the life of his own mother, and he entered this world. And this is Neal Cassady Sr. He came to this world without a mother to a father, whose house became much less visited. And Neal became what he was, a young man now at this point. Through all these trials and tribulations, he's come to assume a trade. He is working under Ralph Schwartz, and Ralph Schwartz is an accomplished barber. And therefore, Neal Cassady Sr. is also a very accomplished barber, and he's able to do a good job cutting hair. So that's where we left off. You ready to take off? It can go anywhere from there, can it not? What are we going to do? Where are we going to go? Wow, let's do it. Yeah?
Neal lived and worked with Schwartz for the next 7 years, from 1910 to 1917. In 1914, at the age of 21, Neal began courting his first girlfriend. Her name was Gertrude Vollmer, and she lived on the same block as Ken's Gables. Schwartz approved of this courtship and especially of her German ancestry.
But in 1917, Neal wanted to enlist in the army and do his patriotic duty in World War I. Rolf and Neal argued over this subject bitterly, and Neal became convinced that it was Schwartz's German ancestry that caused his objection. At this point, the old man was forced to declare to Neal his loneliness and fear of abandonment. This issue of debate was ultimately decided by the government when Neal was called to duty in the second draft.
In the army, Neal became friends with a man named James Trent. Neal looked up to Trent, who Neal felt was far more experienced in many aspects of life. James Trent had come to live with a wealthy aunt after his parents were killed when their family mine collapsed in Arizona. His aunt had protested his participation in the war also, therefore both men were rebelling. The two men took to going to bars and whorehouses, awaiting their departure by ship to Europe, which was scheduled to leave America mid-November of 1918, but the war ended before this departure could take place. Neal Leon Cassady writes,
"This unexpected, though hoped-for, change in orders was greeted with joyous gratification, like a last-minute reprieve by all, except Neal, who felt cheated. In his preparation for imagined battle and death, he had used the bravado of Trent to help overcome his fears. The anticlimactic end troubled him, for he thought warfare might have verified the correctness of his method in attempting to attain a still idolized courageousness. That is, by some real heroic action, he might pull even, make everything right. Reasoning this fashion, he had no excuse for the actions he had committed while in government service, and the guilt of self-knowledge was upon him."
Neal and Trent were given an honorable discharge in 1919 and traveled by train to Kansas City, where they spent several weeks partying while living in a luxury hotel until all of their savings were gone. Neal then went back to Des Moines to Schwartz's barbershop. There he found that Schwartz had grown even more feeble and was becoming senile. Neal stayed only a few months before leaving Schwartz and taking a job selling life insurance. This decision would trouble Neal for years to come. Neal did well selling life insurance, and in March of 1920 he was promoted to a salesman. He bought his first automobile, a Model T, but wrecked it soon after while attempting to jump a 4-foot gully. Neal took a job offer in the Kansas City branch office, eager to get further away from Swartz. Only a few hours in Kansas City, while drinking in a downtown tavern, he ran into James Trent. Both guys were amazed at this chance meeting, and Trent convinced Neal to come and stay with him at his aunt's mansion.
Neal Leon describes this period in his father's life in his prologue to his autobiography.
Neal was caught up in a whirlwind of social affairs which focused on the Whitaker mansion. He was thrust suddenly into the demands of a way of life even more alien to his nature than had been those of the Army. Another adverse development was that James Trent had become the nominal head of a group of fierce little snobs. This group soon rejected Bumpkin Neal.
There at the mansion, Neal was hardly noticed as he sunk into a life of sticking to his room and drinking the free whiskey readily available there. Eventually Neal and Trent had a falling out at a party soon after New Year, 1920, and he left the mansion. He hitchhiked to the barber shop in Des Moines and found it locked up. He broke into the shop and minutes later was arrested and questioned. Neal was able to recall a customer's name, and the customer verified that Neal had indeed been like a son to Rolf Swartz. Neal found out that Swartz had died, and he got farther information from a hobo who had aided Swartz and stayed at the shop's adjoining apartment during Rolf's last days.
Neal reopened the shop for several weeks but then sold it when he received an offer out of the blue. Neal returned to a life of sitting on a park bench and lived off the money he got from the sale until he was down to his last penny. At that point he walked into the best barber shop in town and was hired on the spot. He spent the next 4 years at this barber shop and showed outstanding work ethic. He confined his drinking strictly to Saturday night, but during one of his Saturday binges in 1924, a drunken Neal returned to the shop to get something he had forgotten. He was fumbling with his keys at the lock in the back alley entrance when he was confronted by a policeman. Seeing Neal was drunk, he didn't wait for an explanation and smashed Neal on the bridge of his nose with brass knuckles.
Neal never got the bones set, and lived out the rest of his days with this crooked nose. But surprisingly it was soon after this that Neal became outgoing and sociable, and he began attending social gatherings, be it baseball, poker games, or dances. Neal went to them all. One of his regular customers at the barber shop, who was a golf instructor, got him into a country club. Neal writes,
If one can pinpoint a point in Neal's lifetime that was most balanced and contentedly full, it must be in the year or 18 months following the mutilation of his nose. He was literally at his peak and the happiest he would ever be. Through cultivation of great or near great elite, and by acceptance into the lower strata of this level of society, he made numerous acquaintances and even a few friends. Soon he cut the hair and shaved the faces of more important men than almost any barber in the city.
In 1925, Neal was made manager of the 10-chair barbershop at which he worked. It was at this high point of his life that he was to meet and marry Neal's mother Maude.
Well, now you got Neal's very well done backstory all about his father. It should come as no surprise that Neal's mother's backstory is equally well done and presented by Neal Leon Cassady. And have you noticed already that Neal's writing is very eloquent? It's very, now the parts that aren't the robo voice, the ones that I'm narrating, that's when I'm reading Neal's writing straight from his book, the first third. The rest of it is a condensed version that the robots are reading. And you could, Neal's writing, you could never trust a robot to read it right, because his goal, something he laughed about, was to see how long he could make a sentence. Therefore, you have to add a lot of influctuation, I said that right, to words, and you have to kind of hear it the way he thought it. And the way I think of Neal's writing when I read it, especially because he's writing, you know, the time before his birth, and as we'll get into it, talking about his young childhood. I think about Stewie from Family Guy, because the baby's just like way too intelligent to be a baby. Well, that's kind of how Neal always was. He was, well, okay, let's just get right back into where we were. Let's get back to Neal getting ready to, let's go give the backstory of his mom now. We're rolling.
Born Maude Jean Scheuer in 1890, the youngest of 4 children born to Otto Scheuer, a German immigrant. The Scheuer family lived in Duluth, Minnesota, and the father Otto worked on a steamship on the Great Lakes. He was gone for months at a time. Maude's mother died when she was only 8 years old. Maude was sent to live with the family of a seaman friend of her father's which lived on a farm near Duluth. Her 19-year-old brother had gained employment on the railroad and both of her sisters had moved to Sioux City where they were working as maids for one of the wealthiest families in that city. In 1902, Maude's big sister Carrie, who was now 25, got married and moved to Los Angeles. After 4 years on the farm, at the age of 12, Maude was sent to replace her sister as maid in Sioux City.
Neal Leon Cassady writes,
Now, unlike most rich families, this one had been wonderful employers, and their friendliness towards Carrie became transformed into sheer infatuation with her replacement. When Maude, fresh from the farm, came to Sioux City, she was not yet 13, but one could already discern the extraordinary beauty that she was to possess as a woman. Despite the potential for jealousy, a shy and humble nature made her the favorite of all. Indeed, before long, they went wild over her, and soon she was looked upon almost as another daughter by these emotional people. Yet in the face of all this affectionate attention, she continued to display an unconcern that was as rare as her personal beauty. To be so unpretentious and unaffected was quite unusual for her age, and she was surely all one could desire. Gracious and mild-mannered, she was a gem. The attributes of her character were constantly extolled. Each virtue worked over, carefully catalogued, and commented upon in social circles until there was no limit they could set for her that she could not be expected to attain. Fortunately for their self-esteem, the accuracy of their predictions was upheld. In time, each young man of the town's upper set who was interested in such things came to know of Maude.
In 1906, Maude was courted by James Kenneth Daly, and married to him in the last part of that year at the age of 16. Daly was a lawyer and a politician as well. Over the course of the next 15 years, Maude would give birth to 8 children by her husband James, 4 boys and 4 girls. One of the boys died at birth. In 1919, Daly was elected mayor of Sioux City. But in 1922 Daly died while in office, although not yet 40 years old. Surprisingly, James Daly's will left Maude only the house. There she lived under the watchful and spiteful eye of her mother-in-law. Maude decided to sell the house and move to Des Moines to escape the mother-in-law and all of the memory of James which she felt surrounded by living in that house. The boys, William, Ralph, and John, were quick to get work to help out once in Des Moines. Although she was now somewhat poor, being the widow of a mayor coupled with her beauty gained her acceptance into the social circle of the wealthy wives. She began attending the Sunday concerts held at the Des Moines Country Club. Near the end of the concert year of 1924, she met Neal Cassady, the man who would become her second husband.
So Neal Leon has provided us with the perfect backdrop for how his parents would come to meet and get together, how their paths would intersect. Neal's father's life, Neal Leon's father, Neal Sr., his life has already been a series of ups and downs and roller coaster, with some adventure there, showing some real independence by being able to come into a city at ground level and work his way up and up and down. So, although he's already been presented as possibly having a drinking problem, one has to take into account that he was taking risks that most people wouldn't take, and having achieved that had grown something of a fearlessness to where he could make things harder on himself almost intentionally just to make him challenging. But now he is on the highest upswing of his life. Now as for Neal's mother, Maude, she has been presented as having not really made one single solitary mistake. She came up, and by her good manners and her beauty and her charm, she has come up from being a maidservant all the way up to being the wife of a mayor and the mother of 8 children. Though she was a very young wife, so still not an easy life for Maude, but a life where it would have to be seen as a total success story and something of a stage she's been presented as by Neal so far. Now the one tragic part of her life, or one downswing in her life, was no fault of hers. Her husband died, and with a somewhat, perhaps wicked mother-in-law, she's fallen from grace somewhat, but she's still at the country club levels. Now Neal's father is on the highest upswing of his life, and their paths intersected there, and that's where we're at. Neal's gonna keep going with his story. Here we go.
Neal Leon Cassady writes,
The country club, that small Midwestern American city Des Moines, contained a secluded corner over which on Saturday nights in the winter of 1924 to 25 was enacted a courtship of restraint. Short, well-built bachelor Neal, who with his smashed nose looked rather like a middleweight pug, was in cautious pursuit of the slim, attractive, middle-aged widow Maude, she with the auburn hair and above-average height. The atmosphere of the room, with the fine cuisine and liquors, enhanced the romance. Among other things, this cloak of surroundings, which was to be her last link with the days of leisure, and which was the guise under which Neal was received by Maude, helped to produce the emotion of delight so strongly that she was to commit herself and her children rather willy-nilly into the care of this drink-susceptible man.
Aside from their Saturday night romance, Neal also visited Maude and her family on Sundays and attempted to become friendly with her older boys and played with the younger ones. They went for rides together in Neal's new Star automobile. It was on one of these outings in the car that Neal proposed to Maude, and she accepted. On May 1, 1925, the couple was married. Soon after this, Neal bought a Ford truck with a 2-ton bed. Having had no true honeymoon, the couple decided that they would make an epic journey westward to see the world. Neal began building a house upon the bed of the truck with a sloping roof. It took several months for Neal to finish the construction, but Maude approved of Neal's odd house truck. When it was finally completed that winter, it was decided that Maude's 2 youngest children, ages 5 and 3, would accompany the couple on this western trip, and the 5 older children would remain in Des Moines to fend for themselves.
It was 10 months after their marriage, in the dead of winter, that the couple and 2 small children departed in their house truck heading for California. Maude at this time was also pregnant with her 9th child. She was to deliver this 9th child en route to California on February 8, 1926, at 2:05 a.m. at LDS Hospital in Salt Lake City, Utah. This was Neal's first child, a boy, and he was named after his father. But Neal Sr. had no middle name, so to the boy was added the middle name Leon. After a several-week stay in Salt Lake City to allow Maude to recuperate, they continued their western journey and headed to Los Angeles. With the last of their savings, Neal bought a barber shop on the corner of Hollywood and Vine. But once in business, Neal began taking leave of his job in the afternoon to get drunk. Moreover, he wouldn't allow his hired barbers to operate the shop without him and closed it up. So even with a good location, he was soon out of business and sold his shop for a fraction of what the couple had paid.
At that point, the couple decided to head to Denver with the money they had after the sale of the beauty shop. Maude's brother Charles was living in Denver and encouraged this move, suggesting that the couple make Denver their permanent home. In Denver, Neal leased a small 2-chair barber shop and the family moved their belongings into the rear of the shop. The older children were sent for and arrived by train in Denver, except Maude's 13-year-old daughter, who accepted an offer from a friend of Maude's in Sioux City as a maid. With 9 people and their belongings, they tried to crowd into the shop's 2 small rooms. Almost immediately the older 3 boys struck out on their own. The oldest, Bill, was now 21. Within a month of arriving in Denver, he married a widow who had inherited a large amount of money from her recently deceased husband. The couple opened up a dine and dance club on Denver's western city limits. Bill's younger brothers, Ralph and Jack, began working with a well-known whiskey bootlegger named Blackie Barlow, and soon they were supplying their brother Bill with this illegal service.
Neal's drinking continued to cause him and Maude financial hardship, so she turned to her sons for money. The sons, who were now fed up with Neal, made her promise that Neal wouldn't touch a cent that they gave her. But when the stock market collapsed in 1929, they all fell almost instantly into financial hardship. Neal and Maude were forced to move into even worse confines. Maude turned 2 of her daughters over to Catholic charities so they could be housed in an orphanage until the family could have enough food to eat. On top of that, Maude was pregnant with her 10th child, and on May 22, 1930 she gave birth to a daughter and named her Shirley. Still, Neal's drinking continued, and in 1932 he lost his barbershop and his wife Maude forever. Little Neal went with Big Neal, and the 2 became tenants in Denver's lowest slums.
And that brings us already to the end of episode 3, but a lot of ground got covered. You got to meet Neal's mom, Maude, see what a beautiful woman she was and what a success story she already was before she ever met Neal's father, Neal. Their romance was quick, but then an epic journey. Maude must have had a bit of an adventure bone too to agree on that house truck trip out west, during which little Neal was born in the middle of it all in Salt Lake City, Utah. And now, well, not surprisingly, this, marriage is met with a big downfall. Imagine in that day and age, house truck, family moving around, and so anyhow, Neal and his father going to live in the projects. That's where we're going to pick up next time. Hope you come back. Bye, y'all.